just heard a really good discussion of the U.S.-China relationship. We're now going to pivot and talk about China's new outbound economic policy. We have a great trio of speakers for you. Dr. Evan Medeiros, just to my left, is now Managing Director and Practice Head on Asia at the Eurasia Group. Evan has had a brilliant career in government. He was 6 years Special Assistant to President Obama for Asia policy at the National Security Council. And as you know, that's the hub of U.S. government decision-making on economic, on political, and of course on military strategic affairs. And he's someone with a lot of authority and experience on South China Sea. On North Korea, he'll be our go-to person here. So I want to welcome Evan. To his left is Dr. Elizabeth Economy, who's the CV Star Senior Fellow and Director for Asia Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. I'm a director of that council. We are very proud of Elizabeth and everything she's done. She's published widely on Chinese domestic and foreign policy. Her most recent book that has been published was entitled, By All Means Necessary, How China's Resource Quest is Changing the World, but she has a new book that you cannot yet purchase, but you will be able to shortly, called The Third Revolution, Xi Jinping and the New Chinese State. And so, Elizabeth, welcome. And last but definitely not least is Daniel Rosen, who's founding partner of the Rhodium Group. He leads the firm's work on China and the global economy. He has been an adjunct professor at Columbia, where he's taught a graduate seminar on the Chinese economy since 2001. He also has government experience. In fact, he was a key figure in 2000 and 2001 on Asia policy during the Clinton administration. We both served in that administration at a time when China was coming into the World Trade Organization, and we were normalizing our relations in many ways with China. So we've got a great panel. The last panel, of course, talked about this balance that we have between partnership and competition with China. Partnership, President Obama's joint venture with Xi Jinping on climate change. Partnership, stabilizing the global economy. Competition for predominance militarily in the Asia-Pacific. South China and East China Sea crises. So there's a balance to American policy. And we're going to look now at what China's doing strategically with its vast economic power, now the second largest economy in the world. And I've asked Evan to start off. Each of them will speak. We might have a couple of questions back and forth, but I guarantee you we're going to give you 20 minutes for question and answer from this audience, because I think that's going to be a best for us up here at the panel. Evan, welcome.
Great. Thank you, Nick, very much for that nice introduction, and thank you to the Foreign Policy Association for inviting me. What I thought I would do, given my background, is look at the intersection of security and economics and what that means for China's outbound strategies in Asia and globally. And I'd like to make 3 points, but 3 rather chunky points. Point number 1, it's an obvious point, but it's one that's worth digging into, and that is that China absolutely has a deliberate strategy to try and translate its economic capabilities, its large economy, its trade relationships, its investment relationships, its outbound tourism, all the different tools at its disposal as the second largest economy in the world, to translate that into political and geopolitical influence. Now, this has long been its strategy in Asia, but it's absolutely seeking to do that globally. There are many manifestations of that. Belt and Road, which Liz will talk about, is one of them. AIIB is another one. That's not to say that there are not consistent and persistent economic motivations for what China's trying to do externally. It's certainly looking for access to new markets, capital, technology, and know-how in order to avoid a stalled transition from a middle-income economy to an upper-income economy. China clearly has internalized the lessons of how the U.S. used its economic influence in the global economy after World War II to create political and geopolitical influence. But I think now the Chinese view themselves after the global financial crisis, and now with Xi Jinping, a very different leader, much more active, proactive, willing to accept risk and friction, we see new manifestations of China's efforts to translate its economic capabilities into political and geopolitical influence. Now, there's nothing particularly pernicious about this. I don't want to suggest that this is some subterranean Chinese strategy. This is a natural, normal part of statecraft for any country, certainly for the United States. But the reason I highlight it is because it has always been a particularly large arrow in the Chinese diplomatic quiver. It's something that they have sort of put first, and now that they are not only the second largest economy in the world, but one of the fastest growing economies, it's one that they believe gives them unique purchase on shaping politics and geopolitics. And I think the Chinese like the fact that they like the non-confrontational aspect of creating dependency, either real or perceived, as a mechanism for shaping the interests and preferences of countries around it. There's sort of a coercive but non-confrontational dimension to dependency that fits very nicely with traditional, and by traditional I mean sort of like Tang Dynasty-like aspects of how the Chinese execute statecraft internationally. And it's clear that under Xi Jinping, that China's been willing to take some risk. In other words, explore new and different initiatives that on the one hand put leverage Chinese capabilities to a greater degree, like AIIB and Belt and Road, but also just simply pure coercion. And I'll talk about that in a second, but the willingness to sanction countries that just disagree with China about economic and diplomatic, military affairs, etc. So that's point one. Point number two is that the global and the regional context, and specifically the global and regional economic context for China to translate economic capabilities into political and geopolitical influence is changing. Global trade, which China has always been at the hub of, is rebounding after a few bad years. So look no further than the annual WTO estimates. I think those are pretty good. That global trade in 2015 is going to grow at about 3.6%. Now that sounds like a tiny figure, but it was sort of in the high ones, 1.6, 1.7% last year. So global trade is rebounding, and that always helps China. But it's occurring at the same time at which there's really no clear pathway to global trade liberalization. Global trade, from my perspective, has largely stalled. The WTO, the Doha round, is dead. We're seeing a fragmentation at the regional level. In Asia, the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, what I like to call three adjectives in search of a noun, is 19 economies that are trying to figure out a way to generate a high standard trade agreement, and they've had 19 rounds of negotiations so far, and it's not really getting anywhere. The US withdrew from TPP. The ASEAN Economic Community, which had its great, end of the year success in end of 2015, is not really generating the kind of liberalization of services, finance, labor that were the original expectations for the ASEAN Economic Community. And the one bright spot is TPP 11, the TPP parties minus the United States, which seems to be getting some traction and momentum thanks to the leadership of Japan, Australia, and Vietnam. At the same time, you see, for political reasons, the rise of protectionism and economic nationalism, two related but very distinct phenomena, in large part because of the growth of anti-establishment domestic politics and political forces throughout both the developed markets and the developing markets. In the West, the US and the EU in particular, this support for anti-establishment politics has taken on a very anti-globalization bent, Trump and Brexit. In developed markets, this anti-establishment politics has really given rise to more economic nationalism, and I think you see that in Asia. Technology also is radically going to change trade and investment relations in Asia and globally. What is commonly referred to as Industry 4.0, that combination of robotics, automation, 3D manufacturing, and cloud computing, I think is going to change the nature of manufacturing and trade over the next 10 years. We're actually going to see a recoupling of production and consumption, a shrinking of these highly diversified supply chains throughout Asia, and the declining value of cheap labor as a differentiator in trade relationships. That's going to significantly affect the extent to which countries around China benefit from China's large and growing economy. But here's the one big contextual aspect that I worry about, which is the growing distance between the US and the EU economy and Asian growth and Asian trade. There used to be a very strong correlation. In other words, growth in the US and the EU generated growth in Asia because there was a greater demand for imports from Asia, from Asian trade. But basically, since sort of 2014, 2015, the uptick in growth in the US and EU has not resulted in a corresponding demand for imports of trade from Asia. And what that means is the changing composition of growth in developed markets, less investment, more consumption and services, has meant that Asian economies have had to look for external demand for somewhere else, and that's China. So when you have a world in which trade is volatile and it looks increasingly like it's coming more from China than from the United States, unless there's sort of this some major sort of magical resumption in capital expenditure and investment in the US and the EU, that could have long-term geopolitical implications if the US and the EU are no longer seen as major sources of growth. And when Asian policymakers and business leaders get together, I think what they're focused on first and foremost is the trajectory of Chinese growth, and to some extent US money. I mean, you know, in the global economy today, the US economy is obviously the largest. So, you know, Fed policy, US monetary policy really matters. But unfortunately, we're about to enter into a cycle where Chinese growth is going to be a interesting source, a consistent source of demand for imports from Asia, or exports from Asia. But at the same time, you have the Fed tightening, creating very difficult circumstances for Asian economies who have substantial and growing debt. So that does not sound like a series of economic conditions that privilege the United States. So what does this mean for China's effort to translate economic influence, economic capabilities into political influence? I'd say it's relatively mixed. On the one hand, there are a series of challenges for China. As China's economy slows, albeit I think pretty gradually, and the Chinese economy rebalances from exports and investment to consumption and services, this is going to change the nature of its economic relationships with countries around its periphery. In other words, for those countries that rely on very robust Chinese growth driven by investment, especially in the property sector, countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, and Australia, major exporters of raw materials to China, I think the relationship with China is going to change because there simply is not going to be nearly as much demand from China. Others will benefit. As the Chinese middle class grows, you're going to see a lot more outbound tourism. You're already seeing that in Southeast Asia. Tourism to Thailand and Malaysia is a huge boost to the, quote, services exports to those economies. As Chinese firms become global leaders in key industries, they're going to compete more with the traditional leaders in Japan, Taiwan, South Korea. Semiconductors is a great example. China wants to become a global leader in semiconductors. That's going to put a lot of downward pressure on producers in those major developed markets. You could say the same thing for petrochemicals, probably other sectors as well. So as the Chinese economy evolves and develops, it's going to create new centers of competition with its partners. And that's going to be a big challenge. And then, of course, the fact that China under Xi seems to be more willing to use its economic capabilities for the purposes of coercion. Look no further than China's trade relations with South Korea, the Philippines, Taiwan, and Vietnam. In all of those instances, due to disagreements over whether it's missile defense or territorial disputes or the question of Taiwan, the Chinese use different tools to deny these countries access to China's market. And the question is, how are countries responding? I think for the most part, countries respond by diversifying their sources of supply because they don't want to be vulnerable to a partner or a trade partner that they may disagree with. And that's all occurring at the same time that China is emerging as a major capital exporter. Its FDI into Asia, Europe, and the United States is substantial and growing. Now, an important distinction that Dan will draw out for us is the distinction between stock and flow. On a stock basis, Chinese investment, its FDI into Asia, is quite low. It's a small percentage relative to the US and the EU and Japan, less than 10% stock. But on a flow basis, it's very substantial and growing. And I can tell you as somebody that travels to Southeast Asia frequently, Chinese investment, especially investment in infrastructure, Liz will talk about that, is looked at as a huge opportunity. China is creating, transportation and infrastructure channels to facilitate the trade that everybody relies on. And geopolitically, it's coming at a time where the U.S. looks at best adrift. I agree very much with the assessment of the previous panel that the U.S. administration, from an Asian perspective, looks at best distracted with domestic affairs, very focused in Asia on the North Korea issue, lacking a strategy on China, and at the same time that the U.S.-China relationship is becoming more competitive than it is cooperative, which worries the region, and geopolitical competition between China and Japan, China and India is growing. So why don't I stop there? Thank you.
Thank you, Evan. And a very quick follow-up. You talked about Trans-Pacific Partnership, 40% of global GDP. As I understood it, the Obama administration's big strategic move to try to challenge China and India to conform to international trade practices. President Trump gave it up, didn't get anything in return for it. How costly a tactical or even strategic mistake is that?
It's both a costly tactical and strategic mistake, probably the most costly tactical and strategic mistake, because TPP was not only a political signal to the region that America wants to be your economic partner in the 21st century, because TPP not only included substantial trade liberalization, lowering trade barriers to export more, the most important part of TPP was the rule-making dimension of it. New rules to guide digital trade, new rules to guide environmental and labor rules, new rules for guiding how to manage government procurement and state-owned enterprises. And here's the thing. For Asian economies to grow in the 21st century, most of them are going to need to make structural changes to themselves, diversify away from credit-driven investment and exports to drive growth. Basically, the export train as a growth driver for Asia is reaching its end. And they need to structurally change in order to rely on a healthy combination of domestic demand, domestic consumption, exports, and investment. And the principal vehicle for doing that is not going to be domestic reforms at home, because politically those are difficult for everybody. TPP was the vehicle to do that. TPP would have made sure that not only did the United States send an immediate political signal of interest, but it would have been the way in which the U.S. hardwires itself into the growth strategies for Asian countries for decades going forward. And I guess lastly would be to create a strategic environment in Asia where economies like India and like China, where the state has a heavy role, would have shaped their trajectory. That, combined with TPP, the European agreement, which would have meant TTIP and TPP would have covered 85% of the global economy, it would have created an environment where China would have had some very difficult decisions to make. It would have created very strong incentives for China to liberalize.
Thank you. And a big political signal by the United States that we intend to remain the leader in Asia.
Absolutely.
Elizabeth, so Evan's talked about, on an overview basis, what the Chinese are doing economically in Asia. The Belt Road Initiative is a big strategic move by China. If we've given up a big strategic initiative, China has one. which is long-lasting. I know you want to talk about that and other issues.
All right, so thanks. It's great to be here. I'm part of such a terrific panel with you and Evan and Dan. Evan raised the Belt and Road Initiative, and so I'm going to expand a little bit upon that. I think it'll give you a bit of a flavor of how China's engagement is actually playing out on the ground globally. So Xi Jinping launched One Belt, One Road, which has become known now as the Belt and Road Initiative, back in 2013 in September, so 4 years ago actually this month. And in its initial incarnation, it really was primarily an infrastructure plan, a grand-scale infrastructure plan to link China's wealthy coastal cities to its interior and western regions that are less well developed, and then to take all of China and link that through ports and railroads and highways and pipelines through to the rest of Asia, to Europe, to Middle East, and then out to Africa. It was a kind of recreation of the old Silk Road and maritime spice routes. Part of his rejuvenation of the great Chinese nation in an effort to sort of reclaim some of China's historic greatness. Over the past 4 years, the plan has evolved to expand into much greater areas of connectivity, so to include telecommunications, culture, trade, and finance. So if it's fully realized, it would really reorient in some fairly significant ways, I would say, international relations. You might imagine that this was a plan that was enthusiastically received by many players in the world. 68 countries have signed on to be partners to the Belt and Road Initiative, and they represent 40% of global GDP and about 4.4 billion people. From the perspective of China, the benefits of the Belt and Road Initiative are pretty easy to see. In the near term, there are some significant economic advantages. China can export its overcapacity. So while it's planning to lay 22,000 kilometers of railroad globally, it can also use 85 million tons of Chinese steel that it doesn't know what else to do with. So as the Chinese economy has slowed and its own development has reached a certain level, it's looking to export its coal-fired power plants and its construction capabilities and its cement and all the rest of it. So that's one near-term benefit. Longer term, I think the plans for a digital road to have the Beidou satellite system and laying fiber optic cables and sending out Xiaomi phones and Alibaba and e-commerce. All of this, I think, will also tend to bind all of these economies more closely to China, again, over the long term. This is a 30, 50, 70, 100-year plan that China has set in motion. This is not a near-term tactical initiative. It is strategic thinking. So it doesn't really matter to China that only 20% of the population in Laos, for example, has a connection to the internet at home. They're thinking about Laos 50 years from now, and they're going to be the player that brings the internet and everything else to those people. There are also strategic benefits that China sees from the Belt and Road Initiative. Some of them have to do with the idea that development, economic development, will help to quell unrest and unhappiness in its own border regions like Xinjiang. And also moving through to Pakistan and other places. But it also has to do with Chinese access to ports. China now has a stake in 30 of the largest 50 ports in the world. In some cases, it's a majority stake. And although in many instances it's said that it's not going to use those ports for military purposes, we've seen that where, in fact, it has taken a stake, for example, in Greece, it has sent PLA Navy ships there. Just to visit. So, I think the promise of no military use, I don't take very seriously. I think we can look, I think that's a statement for now, but over time, we'll see that element develop more. For the recipient countries, for the host countries, as well, of course, the advantages are great because you're getting big increase in infrastructure that you otherwise wouldn't have access to. Near-term costs are very low. Long-term, they've got to pay them back. The cost can be quite high. But in the short term, it seems like a gift. And for the more well-developed countries in Europe that will get tied into this, it also affords easier connectivity and greater access to the Chinese market, which, as Evan has indicated, is one of the great engines of global growth these days. But the reality is somewhat more complicated. And so let me just share with you a couple of ways in which the picture's not as rosy as it may seem when you kind of hear about this kind of grand scale initiative. First, the Chinese themselves have some concerns. And if you talk to Chinese officials and scholars and certainly business people, there are a lot of projects that are being put on the books that they're not interested in doing, that they think are a bad idea, in fact. Why do you want to take a 70% stake in a Sri Lankan port, for example, in the near term, that has almost no traffic? Right? They've already built a $200 million airport that lands in Sri Lanka that lands 2 planes per day. So there's a lot of concern that a lot of these strategically minded investments, so investments that are done for strategic military reasons, are not economically very sound. They have an oil refinery in Kyrgyzstan that's operating at 6% capacity. So are they going to get their money back? This is a major concern. Also concern about security around some of these projects. So if you're putting a lot of your investment to a place like Pakistan, there have already been several attacks on some of the construction efforts underway, the joint construction efforts underway there. So I think that that's another issue that the Chinese companies, the people that are being asked to go out and invest, that they're not as excited about some of these projects as the Chinese government would like them to be. For the recipient countries, for the host countries, there are longstanding concerns. So, Chinese outward bound investment, its infrastructure development, natural resource quest have been going on for, since 1999 in a pretty concentrated way. And so there's a lot of experience out there in Africa and Asia in terms of how Chinese actors tend to behave. And by and large, the experience has been mixed at best. So Chinese investors, infrastructure and resource investors, tend not to operate with the highest standards of environmental governance or labor standards. Transparency is very weak. And oftentimes the Chinese government and another authoritarian government will strike a deal that doesn't really engage the broader population, doesn't think about what the needs might be there. You might have seen very recently the deal that the Chinese struck with Pakistan, sort of the behind-the-scenes deal that was not released to the broader public, that involved a major surveillance effort, that involved a big push for Chinese TV, CCTV, to get to penetrate through Pakistani society, and also access to Pakistani land and agriculture, which is actually a very sensitive issue for most populations, not just that in Pakistan. So a lot of unhappiness within the Pakistani population when they realized that there was a second sort of more secret deal that had been struck between the Chinese government. And finally, there's a lot of competition now that China's Belt and Road Initiative has stirred up. The Japanese have their own plans on the books, a $250 million plan that they want to sort of invest and say, put a little bit more money forward and do this in an environmentally sustainable way. So that's, another initiative. The Indians also are getting engaged. The Indians and the Japanese are working together and developing a port in Iran. The Europeans are concerned that the Chinese are coming in with, lack of transparency and standards and trying to do deals in Central and Eastern Europe. And even ASEAN is concerned. So they don't necessarily want the Chinese presence everywhere, penetrating, through culture and infrastructure. So all of this is to say that you read the headlines and you see Chinese pledges, X amount of investment. There are 900 deals underway. Bear in mind that, roughly a third of those deals actually get realized. When you look 6 years out, Chinese investment stated up front. What you hear is pledged. Actually, much less is actually realized. About a third of the Chinese pledged investment is actually internal to China. So when you look at what the Belt and Road has accomplished after 4 years, it's much less than I think many people would have imagined. There are probably about 10 to 15 significant projects underway. When you see the big numbers, a lot of those projects were started before 2012. Everything is now included in Belt and Road. The sale of Carnival Cruise Lines is included in the Belt and Road. So just bear in mind that, that the reality is somewhat less than the promise. And my last point that I'll make is, despite my sort of sanguine conclusion there, I would say that I think the U.S. is absent from all of this. And we have no plan in mind in terms of either real engagement in the Belt and Road or efforts to somehow compete. And I think this is an enormous strategic mistake.
If we had more time right now, I would ask that question, a follow-up question to what Elizabeth just said. So I hope when we go to you, someone's going to ask Elizabeth or even the panel, what should the United States do to respond? A lot of people have, I think, mistakenly and aptly compared the Belt Road Initiative to the Marshall Plan. Different time, different part of the world. But remember that it was Stalin's fateful decision to reject the Marshall Plan, not only for the Soviet Union, but for all of Eastern Europe, which held the East Europeans back, politically and economically, of course, for 2 generations. So the question for this panel, I hope from one of you or several of you, will be, how should the United States, President Trump, respond to this with an initiative of our own? Do we join this? Do we join the Indians and Japanese in some triangular counterweight to it? But before we get to questions, Dan.
Thank you, Nick. It's a pleasure to be back here again. I'm going to make a couple points, try to do it real crisply, quick. Focused in on China's outbound economic policy changes of late dynamics. First point I want to make is that there is a combination here of what is really policy and what is just prospects and action by Chinese parties who have a comparative advantage of doing something externally. Not all of this is strategic, what we're seeing. Even some of the grandest flows that have shown up on the radar screen, the outbound direct investment flows, aren't necessarily strategic or policy outcome. Now, it's not always in Beijing's interest to point that out to us. We tend to convince ourselves that this is all an incredible grand design by brilliant planning process, and when your rival adversary in the game convinces themselves of something, then why stop them? But where that becomes tricky for China is that these things that are just happening versus these things that are policy have consequences out there in the world. And the world is reacting to these things as though they do reflect Chinese intentionality and motive. So step back for a second to the things that really are policy. Take Belt and Road. Not all policy is the same. Some policy is really well designed. It's stress tested against the challenges that occur when you try to implement a policy. We look back at the really big policy actions by Beijing, even internally in terms of the development process. A lot of success, a lot of growth generated, but huge unintended consequences in the development model that they still haven't figured out how to clean up and fix. First and foremost in economic terms, the debt load that the country carries. When you think about the quality of Chinese policy, my favorite quote of the year was from the insurance regulator, who earlier in the year said, "Don't worry about speculators trying to take advantage of our insurance sector situation. We have created our own Maginot Line to take care of that." I hope that there's some giggling, at least from the Marshall side of the room here. The Maginot Line was a complete failure of policymaking, of course, to try to maintain something that wasn't maintainable. So really, I put a question mark around the quality of the stuff that really does reflect policy. And then there's quite a lot of stuff which doesn't really reflect policy intentionality by Beijing, but very often Beijing trying to catch up to activity, outbound direct investment that they really didn't intend in the first instance, and have to see either retrofit a picture of, this was our policy intention onto, or think about changing the way they run the system. So inadvertent consequences. On the one hand, China wants to have a renminbi, a currency that plays a larger part, has a larger share of global transactions. On the other hand, to do that, necessarily, if you understand monetary dynamics, requires that they expose themselves to all sorts of financial risks at home that comes from having a freely tradable currency, because it doesn't have value as a global instrument if it's not market tradable and predictable in terms of how that currency is going to behave. So they put a big policy on the table. We're going to push renminbi internationalization, and then it collapsed in on them. And they essentially blew up their own first several years of effort to make the renminbi tradable in Hong Kong, for example, offshore from what they're doing. On Belt and Road, as Liz pointed out, and as Evan noted as well, AIIB, great idea in principle, stoking global demand for Chinese exports, great idea in principle. The biggest single Chinese client for Chinese development credit globally today is Venezuela. Venezuela, as the poster child for what China's contribution to stoking global demand looks like, $65 billion worth of credit extended, the vast bulk of which will never be recovered and has probably set back Venezuela's demand curve, if you will, by decades, let's say, and undermine the development process. So I'm not sure that that was well understood by China in the first round of setting out these policies. We could parse through the RCEP that Evan mentioned, the trade design, the 3 adjectives in search of a noun. APEC, by the way, was 4 adjectives in search of a noun.
And no noun.
And no noun at all, right? So I guess you call that progress, but I don't know. So which are which? Which of these are policy and not just folks doing what they do when the government gets out of the way and the government coming later and claiming credit for it, right? And of those that are policy, which are really robust and are going to endure? We're at this moment when it kind of seems like what Beijing says is going to happen, that they've got that ability to deliver that right now, but that's not actually the track record. This is not the first time China has put out a grand policy design. Take, for example, Made in China 2025 was preceded by an indigenous innovation campaign a decade ago that didn't achieve its objective. So now, instead of building next generation industries at home, they have taken it in mind to go out and purchase them globally. But that has precipitated this pushback, not just from the United States, but from the Germans, the Australians, Canadians, many others as well. It's kind of triggered an allergy to Chinese policy and behavior, which really wasn't, I think, adequately thought through in policy planning circles in Beijing, would be my view. I could go on, but I'll just, if I can take 30 seconds, point out 2 more things. Even with all the missteps and fumbling Beijing is characterized by right now to some extent, anything other than an utter collapse of the Chinese development prospect portends trillions of dollars of outbound financial flows out of China that haven't even woken the world up yet. We think of China as globalized only in trade terms. As a portfolio investment story, it hasn't even begun. We haven't even started Act 1. We're listening to the overture of the show. We're talking trillions of dollars of new capital deployed into global capital markets that will shock Wall Street and its ilk, the city in London, in the same way that Peoria and South Carolina textiles were shocked a generation ago in our lives. We have that to look forward to. When that happens, as that happens, there's no way for it to happen. There's no way for China to deploy that financial heft overseas without corresponding inflows of global capital into China, right? We talked earlier this year, we saw the first steps with Morgan Stanley's capital equity index, China being added as a very small share of the global index for an ideal portfolio. There's every reason why global capital, my retirement funds, everybody up here's, a chunk of it, 5% over time, shouldn't be deployed into Chinese capital markets, equities and bonds. That won't happen unless there's radical changes to the politics of how China's economy is run. There's a fiduciary duty at Fidelity, Vanguard, Ontario Teachers, CalPERS, not to deploy that capital into China unless there's some basic assurance that the capital markets are guided by rule of law. The outflows are hardwired. There's no way for China not to deploy trillions overseas. The corresponding balancing inflows into China are not hardwired and are contingent on them transforming their political system, not just their economic rules. And that's a really radical notion if you follow it through. I'll stop there.
Excellent. Thank you, Dan. Thanks to Dan, Liz, Evan. Terrific, I thought, compelling discussion. And we've just started. Over to you. I'm looking towards the students first. I'm a professor. I'll just call on one of the students, if that's okay, in the front row.
Back there.
Okay. Yes. Right back there.
The redheads always get called on first.
Is that right?
Hi there. I'm Elizabeth Hardiman from Farmingdale High School History Club. I just had a question for Dr. Economy specifically, if you had the chance. You mentioned something about how China's expansion into China's expanding into resources and also taking stake in multiple foreign ports. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about how that is impacting international security and what steps the United States could take to help safeguard international security while also preserving our diplomatic relationship with China. Thank you.
Right.
Very good question. Thank you. Liz?
Great. Thank you. So, as I mentioned, China's been investing in resources globally for 2 decades, really, since 1999 and the Go Out policy. And through that process, I would say it has made as many friends as, if not enemies. China can be its own worst enemy, I would say, in terms of its investment. You could find places like Zambia where entire elections are changed because the people were so upset with the level of Chinese and the nature of Chinese investment. So to some extent, U.S. strategy can be to let China dig its own grave, because until China begins to operate at standards that match those of the United States or the EU or Japan, there is a lot of unhappiness in a lot of different countries about Chinese investment coming in. So I think, to some extent, you could say we should stand back. And I should point out, Evan made the difference between stock and flow in terms of investment. The U.S. is a much larger investor in places like Africa than China is. Even in Southeast Asia, it goes back and forth between the United States and China. Latin America, obviously, the United States is a larger investor. So we paint a giant picture of China and its role, and it's growing, but don't be misled in terms of sort of where the state of affairs actually stands right now. In terms of Chinese stake in ports, I do think that this is a source of some concern. All the countries say that they are retaining the right to determine whether or not and who comes into their ports. So Sri Lankan government says, even though China has a 70% stake in the port, the Sri Lankan government, we retain the right to, decide what military can come or not come. I think the best strategy is, positive military-to-military relations the U.S. maintains with all of our allies and then some. I think it was one of the great strengths of the Obama administration, for example, that they were out there in Asia forging stronger military relations. The whole pivot and rebalance was premised on moving 60% of our air and naval forces to Asia. And I think this was a really important effort. And thank goodness, I would say. I think under the current administration, we seem to have an excellent Secretary of Defense, Mattis, who also understands the value of maintaining good relations and expanding on those relations. So, the PLA, and I'd let Evan say something about this. I think the PLA and the PLA Navy have yet to attain the same level of respect, of ability, to develop relationships. They're trying. There's a lot of military exchange, but I think the U.S. still commands a greater level of relationships globally. Did you want to?
Sure, I'll come in here because the Chinese military and especially the Chinese Navy is an important part of this question. And there are a few different ways to come in it. One is, as China gains access to these different ports, it's absolutely going to use them as entry points for the Navy in different parts of the world, right? We already see this with Djibouti. China has its first naval, its naval base abroad. We're going to see more of this. Now, the Chinese will probably not call them bases, pick your euphemism, but nonetheless, the Chinese Navy absolutely positively is interested in expanding its scope of operations beyond just the Western Pacific. It's already in South Asia. I think we're going to see more of that. But to Liz's point, we're still in the early stages of China becoming a truly effective regional military. On the question of what experts call regional security cooperation, that's joint exercises, joint training, arms sales. I'd say the Chinese are, on a scale of 1 to 10, they're probably at sort of 2 to 3. But they're fast learners. And, here's the thing. Within 10 years, we're going to probably have another 2 to 3 Chinese aircraft carriers in the Western Pacific. China is going to have by far the largest and most sophisticated navy in Asia. It's going to present real challenges for the United States and for other major regional militaries. And its ability to create economic relationships that it can leverage for military purposes is only going to increase.
I would just add one point to this before the next question. The Chinese have run the port of Piraeus in Greece. Greece is a NATO ally. And we've begun to see the Greek government now block initiatives of both the European Union and NATO critical of China. Both organizations operate on consensus, so every nation has to agree. And because of this massive inflow of capital to an ailing Greek economy, the Greeks have begun to pull their punches in a way that's injurious to the United States and our European allies. So we're seeing it not just in Gwadar in Pakistan, we're seeing it in the heart of Europe as well. Next question. Yes, sir. Right back here with your hand up.
I'm James Taylor. We haven't yet talked about energy or in the role of the Chinese economy and impact on the environment. Dr. Economy, I know that's an expertise of yours. And I wondered that it was a particular accomplishment of Obama and an engagement of Xi in the signing of the Paris Accord. And I wondered if you could tell us what you think the impact of the U.S. withdrawal from the Paris Agreement and how that will impact China and China's leadership in its leadership in the Paris Accord and in the environment.
Okay, I'll be brief because I want to have more questions, but I think from the perspective of the Chinese, it's almost a golden opportunity because already China's commitment within the Paris Accord was not all that significant. It basically pledged to cap its emissions by 2030, but never set any kind of actual cap. But it got a lot of credit simply by stepping up to the plate and working with the United States on it. Now it can stand, as it did, as Xi Jinping did, and say basically, we are the great defenders of the Paris Climate Accord. We are the great champions of globalization without actually having to do so much more. To give them credit, they are pushing forward in large part for domestic reasons in capping their coal emissions, but they're exporting a lot of coal capacity to other countries. So in terms of their overall contribution to climate change, if you look at it from that perspective, I think it's going to continue to remain where it is and perhaps even increase. They're also pushing forward on new energy vehicles and electric vehicles. They see the whole field of clean energy as one that they can lead and perhaps capture in terms of global markets as they had with solar energy. So I think that's a positive. But I think, are we going to see real leadership emanating from China on this issue of climate change? Are they going to step up and say, actually, we should have an agreement on methane. We should begin to think about the other greenhouse gases. I don't see that forthcoming. I think they're happy to take all of the congratulations, and I think they're happy to try to capture markets. But I don't see them forging any new kind of major climate accord moving forward.
Thank you. Yes, right here. Mike is coming right behind you.
Thank you. Ali Mazzara with State University of New York, Office of Global Affairs. And I'm going to quote a Harvard professor who asked us to ask the panel, what should the U.S. response be to the One Belt and One Road initiative?
Well, that was the question we wanted to ask. Exactly right. Dan, do
you want to say something, Dan, first?
And I have to say, unfortunately, we started late. And you have to get to lunch, and some of the people here have to leave. So maybe we can use this question to have each of you, Dan, starting with you. This is a compelling question. What should we do in response to this?
Yeah,
Since
okay.
you asked it, Nick,
Yeah,
it is
I'm
compelling.
very
Yes.
Everyone up here will have something to offer on this and has done a lot. I would point out this, and it's reiterating a point Liz did make, that the vast bulk of what has been labeled Belt and Road activity so far predated the formalization of Belt and Road concept as a policy, right? So a lot of this is just kind of business as usual economic activity from a large economy that has a big capital goods manufacturing sector, power equipment, rail, rolling stock and locomotives and whatnot for train systems and all that kind of stuff. So that's going to be part of a global economic equation that China is going to be a big purveyor of that sort of stuff. How they finance the marketing of all that stuff has big developmental consequences. Do that well and right, take advantage of all the lessons learned at the World Bank, ADB, and other places over the years. all the lessons that made them very bureaucratic and gave Beijing an opportunity to say, we're going to do this in a new, less bureaucratic way. It's going to be better. But there's a reason, unfortunately, why that bureaucracy existed. There's a reason why a lot of bureaucracies in Washington, D.C. probably shouldn't just be blown up. Because wouldn't it be great if we had smaller government, smaller State Department, for example? This sort of thinking doesn't really pay the bills in the long run. And we're seeing the early negative dividends in places like Venezuela, Sri Lanka, elsewhere too, of doing this too fast without taking account of lessons learned. So what should the U.S. do? Stick to its guns, I think. And when the time is right to join something like AIIB, when those lessons have been encapsulated and demonstrated that China understands them, we should be very enthusiastic about being part of a process of working together. Until that time, got to be principled and not jump on any bandwagons, Belt and Road or otherwise, just because there's a lot of money to be made in the near term.
Okay, I'll just say two things. First, I think the most important thing we could do would be to get back into the Trans-Pacific Partnership. You know, relabel it. We used to joke about this, the Trump-Pacific Partnership. Yeah. Do something, but get back in. Find our way back in. Fiddle with a few things and get back in there. I think that's the most important thing we can do to reestablish U.S. Economic leadership in the region. Beyond that, I think what you mentioned, Nick, I think we should be looking at partnerships with Japan and India. I think we each can bring our own capabilities to bear. The U.S. has, the biggest and most comprehensive satellite system, for example. We can, even though Japan's developing its own, we can partner with them. We can partner with India and think about how to ensure that as development comes throughout Asia and the rest of the developing world, that it's done at really good environmental labor standards.
Thank you.
I'll make 2 points. I completely agree with my colleagues. What China is doing is less important to me than how China does it, because we're not going to be able to, no country can stop China from what it's doing. And providing more access to infrastructure is absolutely a global good, assuming it's done in the right way. So I agree with Liz, get back into TPP. That's a given. But what I would do is have the United States position itself as a leader on this issue of infrastructure. Under the Obama administration, President Obama held 2 rolling global summits, the Global Nuclear Security Summit and the Global Healthcare Summit, or Global Health Security Summit. He did it because he was trying to establish American leadership about how the world should be talking about, defining issues, and pursuing them. What about if the United States convened a Global Infrastructure Investment Summit to begin working with China? So don't criticize Belt and Road. Talk about how Belt and Road can connect with the initiatives of the World Bank, of the ADB, what Japan's doing, what India's doing, in order for the United States to be driving that conversation about standards and mechanisms in order to draft off what has been currently done, through multilateral development institutions, in order to create more of a global conversation. Point number 2. If you take anything away from this panel, and this is especially for the students in the room, and in particular for our friends from West Point, the dynamic between strategic competition and economic interdependence in Asia will define global order in the 21st century. And so when you look at national security questions, I know the organizational bias is always to look at things like the military balance, the order of battle of countries, national security strategies, and that's all essential. But in a globalized world of a high degree of technological, economic interdependence, rapid flow of ideas, economics is going to be trade, investment, finance. All of those flows are going to be essential to shaping the national security perceptions of policymakers all over the world. And I think the Chinese leadership understands that. That's why economic policy plays such a centerpiece. I don't think the U.S. could do a better job of appreciating the way that its economic role in the world should be the leading edge of its broader national security strategy. Thank you.
I am sorry we have to bring this to a close. There's so much more to say, but Dan and Liz and Evan have given us a lot to think about. Please join me in thanking them.